Okay, well, it is 12 o'clock and I see we've got most people here already. So I am going to get us started. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar, Changing the Conversation, Research, Surprising Findings, and the Volunteer Screening Program. My name is Vicki Shaughnessy and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Senior Coordinator of Learning and Resources at Volunteer Alberta, and I work for the Volunteer Screening Program. And if you don't know what that is already, I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm joined by my manager, Graham Dearden, who is behind the scenes, and they'll be helping out in the chat to answer any questions you might have throughout the presentation. So if you do have questions, we do have sort of like a little Q&A box that you can pop those into. There is an option as well for folks to sort of like those questions. So if you have the same question that someone else has already asked, you can sort of just like it. We will save a bunch of questions for the end. We will have about 15 minutes of a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and Graham will be sort of just answering questions as we go along, some of those more simple questions as well. The session will be recorded and we will share it after the event. We'll send it out and we'll also post it on our website. And I'll also be referencing some reports, tools, templates, and additional resources throughout the presentation. And I'll be sharing all of that in a follow-up package after the event. So definitely stay tuned for that. I encourage everyone here to pop in the chat right about now your name, maybe what organization or geographic location you're signing in from, and maybe a bit about what prompted you to come to the presentation today. The last thing I'll note is this is a pretty long presentation today, and unfortunately I won't have time in the middle to take a little break. So just please do what you need to take care of yourself during the presentation. So drink water, take stretch breaks, and all of that good self-care kind of stuff too. Let's see if the slide will go here. Here we go. Okay, so before we get started, I want to do a land affirmation. So Volunteer Alberta's main office is situated on Treaty 6 territory, specifically Amiskwatsiwaskagan, as it is referred to by the Plains Cree peoples, among other Indigenous names, and we also reside on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Our staff, board, and our work reach across Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and we affirm both the historical and current relationships of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples to this land as an act of reconciliation, and also with the awareness that recognizing or acknowledging these facts is not enough. So Volunteer Alberta is actively working to learn about how our organization can contribute to and support reconciliation and Indigenous resurgence in Alberta, including our responsibilities as treaty people. So we encourage you to visit nativeland.ca to learn more about the land and its nations where you live, work, and play, and your responsibilities as a treaty person, if that's where you reside, as opposed to unceded territory. So here's a little agenda of how today's conversation is going to go. I'll dive a bit into the background. So what is the Volunteer Screening Program and why did we embark on this research project? Then I'll cover quickly our approach as well as a bit of methods and analysis. And we'll spend the most of time on this session talking about the research findings. We'll also spend some time on some learning moments, and then we'll end with a little bit of time for a Q&A. So first, what is the Volunteer Screening Program? Volunteer Screening Program is a collection of different educational and funding opportunities to help organizations develop their volunteer screening capacity. And when we say volunteer screening or just screening, we're very broadly describing the process of defining the relationship between volunteers and organizations. We generally use the 10 steps to screening, if you've ever heard of those. But basically, screening is a really big topic that encompasses a lot of smaller subtopics, and all of those aim to improve the quality and safety of the programs and services in our communities. So knowing what we mean by screening, the Volunteer Screening Program is a partnership between Volunteer Alberta and the Government of Alberta, provides educational resources and tools designed to help nonprofit organizations improve their volunteer screening processes and procedures, And we offer financial opportunities to aid organizations in their volunteer screening efforts, including the Vulnerable Sector Check Fee Waiver and volunteer screening development grants. And lastly, please understand that Volunteer Alberta does not provide legal advice. This webinar and our resources will provide some useful general information, but you should bring any concerns specific to your organization and your work to a legal professional or maybe even your insurance provider. So why did we embark on this research project? First, VA and the government of Alberta developed the volunteer screening program in its current form after recognizing that nonprofit organizations relied on police checks or background checks in place of comprehensive relationship-based screening policies and practices. And after 6 years of developing educational programming through the volunteer screening program, there's still room for the conversation around volunteer screening practices to change, and especially to shift to respond to some of the current trends and challenges that have emerged in the past few years. So the pandemic shone a spotlight on inequities in various systems, including the nonprofit and voluntary sector. And reports from the Volunteer Connector, the Minnesota Alliance for Volunteer Advancement, and UK-based Dr. Helen Timbrell all support the conclusion that many aspects of what is considered best practices in volunteer screening and engagement actually create barriers for equity-deserving communities, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC. Therefore, there's a big need to start shifting the volunteer screening conversation to account more for equity, diversity, and inclusion, or as VA has started to refer to it, IDEAs, which includes inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, and social justice. And this is a new language shift for us. And so throughout this presentation, you will often see EDI, we are shifting our language in the future more to ideas. It was just that this survey and all the development happened before that language shift. So a lot of these environmental changes are why VSP's educational programming is emphasizing a shift from best practices to good practices. We know that best practices, which are handed down by capacity builders or experts, they're really prescriptive and they don't address the individualized dynamics, culture, and needs of the regional or cultural communities that nonprofit organizations operate within. We also recognize that best practices implies a one-size-fits-all approach to volunteer screening and engagement, which we know that doesn't actually exist. We know organizations and communities need to have flexible tools to respond and adapt to their community's unique needs and start implementing good practices that are informed by and grounded in the communities that we work with. So given all of that, we basically wanted to pause and reflect on our program to ensure that we're entering the next phase of VSP in an intentional way and one that's grounded in the needs of our community. So we wanted to check that our program goals are still relevant and whether we may need to focus our efforts, where we may need to focus our efforts to continue achieving our goals in the future and better serve our community. So our approach to research focused on three main things. First, we needed to check ourselves and identify gaps. We wanted to check if the current resources we offer are meeting the needs of our community and where gaps may exist. So we spoke with and surveyed volunteer engagement specialists. So that's managers, coordinators, or anyone who works primarily with volunteers on a day-to-day basis. So we spoke with and surveyed those folks as well as volunteers themselves in order to capture a broad spectrum of knowledge and experiences and ensure that there's a balanced representation of the information that's informed both by organizations as well as volunteers themselves. Next, we needed to establish benchmarks and explore current trends. So to evaluate the future effectiveness of our programming, we determined program objectives or outcomes and established benchmarks to measure our future project. And in a minute, I'll explain a little bit more about, outcomes and benchmarks and all that kind of stuff. We also explored new and emerging trends in the volunteer screening and engagement landscape to ensure that we're capturing what's top of mind for our community. And last, we wanted to adapt our program. So to do that, we're taking an evidence-based approach, and we are ensuring that the future of our program is grounded in the data gathered from our community members. So the activities that we ended up doing towards all of these ends are, we did 4 focus groups with nonprofit voluntary sector organizations. If you see NPVS, that means nonprofit voluntary sector organizations. We also did 4 focus groups with volunteers. We did a nonprofit benchmark survey and also a volunteer benchmark survey. And in this presentation, I'll be focusing mainly on the survey results, but I will mention areas where our focus group supported the information or provided more details about a particular topic. So if you're interested to learn more about what was asked and what was said in our focus group specifically, we'll be sending out a PDF report, and it's titled the same thing as this presentation. And basically that report goes into greater detail about both the focus groups as well as the survey results. So I will be sending that out after the presentation. So I just want to give a quick overview of our methods and the analysis process. Basically, what I want you to see here is the progression from program outcome on the left all the way to future areas of focus on the right. We developed our survey questions based on the outcomes and indicators originally established for the volunteer screening program. So we have 7 broad outcomes for the program that include short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes. And on the screen in that left-hand column is just one example of, an outcome that we have set. We then developed indicators to help us measure our outcomes. And we have 32 indicators that relate back to those 7 broad outcomes. And again, what you see on the screen here is just one example of an indicator. Next, we developed survey questions based on those indicators. So we had 60 survey questions in the nonprofit survey and around 50 questions on the volunteer survey. So there's a lot of data for us to sort through. From that data, we were able to set benchmarks. So essentially, where is our community currently at for these various indicators? And in the future, we're going to sort of do these types of surveys again, and then we'll be able to see, have those benchmarks moved at all? And are we, reaching our goals in the way that we want to? Lastly, from those benchmarks, we've set some future areas of focus that will help us reach those broad outcomes in the future. So if you want to learn more about our methods or how we sort of set up the focus groups or the benchmark surveys, you can definitely read the report as we go into a little bit more detail about that. Okay, so on to the findings. We also want to make sure that organizations have some concrete things to take away from this session. So we'll also be doing some learning moments based on the data, and we have some recommendations for organizations based on all of that. So the first thing is to get a sense of who responded to our surveys. We had 71 respondents to the nonprofit survey and 38 respondents to the volunteer survey. And I feel really good about the response rate for the nonprofit survey. 71 responses is, I think, definitely good enough to, start to be able to draw some inferences and averages from that information. With 38 responses in the volunteer survey, however, we need to be a bit more careful not to overgeneralize these results. We can, and we do throughout this presentation, make some inferences from this data, but it's just important to keep that in mind as we go through the data, that we did have a smaller sample size or a smaller response rate for the volunteer survey, and we just need to be careful of not overgeneralizing those results too much. For the nonprofit survey, most respondents, 89%, were from nonprofit organizations as opposed to co-ops or social enterprises or some other organizational structure. Most organizations who responded to this survey fall into the categories of culture and recreation, social services, or health. And 92% of respondents indicated that their organizations serve vulnerable populations, which is important when we're looking at questions related specifically to vulnerable sector searches or risk assessment tools or things like that. Over on our volunteer survey, 85% of respondents did not identify as vulnerable, which only applied to a couple of questions that we asked. When we asked what locations in Alberta the nonprofits serve or where volunteers were engaged, we used the 2018 Alberta Health Services map. We're not affiliated with AHS, we simply borrowed their map for our project. And most nonprofit organizations who replied to the survey, they primarily served Calgary zone, then the next frequent was Edmonton zone, and then the central zone. We didn't get too many responses from organizations who serve the north zone or the south zone, unfortunately. For volunteers, the majority of respondents have volunteered in Edmonton as opposed to other zones in Alberta or even remotely or virtually. The nonprofit organizations who took our survey serve a very diverse set of equity-deserving communities. So we had a big, long list of things that we included, but some of those examples are the 2S LGBTQI+ community, newcomers to Canada, seniors, people with disabilities, or people experiencing houselessness. That was, just a short example of our list there. Over on our volunteer survey, it was a fairly even split of folks who identified as belonging to an equity deserving group or not. So 47% of folks identified as belonging to an equity deserving group, as opposed to 50% who said they did not. And lastly, for our nonprofit survey, most respondents, 79%, were paid staff, but we did have some volunteers who were answering on behalf of the organizations they volunteer for. So we asked a lot of questions on both surveys, and I won't be able to dive into each one. So I'll focus in on some of the responses we found most interesting and surprising. And also just to note that throughout this presentation, anytime you see the color purple, that's from the nonprofit survey. And anytime you see sort of that yellow or orangey color, that is from the volunteer survey. So let's jump into some of the survey questions. The first interesting result came from the question, why does your organization screen its volunteers? And the majority of organizations, 51%, answered that the primary or only reason they screen volunteers is for public safety and protection of vulnerable people. 14% of respondents did not mention safety or protection and focused instead on screening as a way to match volunteers to the right role at the organization, to ensure that organizations are matching volunteers to roles that will be fulfilling for them, and then to also properly set their expectations for that role. Only 17% answered in a way that we feel reflects good practices in screening, which is that volunteer screening should be about both safety and protection of vulnerable people and matching volunteers to the right role. So this is a little bit lower than what we expected, and our goal is to increase this number and increase nonprofits' understanding that screening should be approached as a way to create a mutually beneficial relationship between volunteers and the organization. And what's interesting is when we pop over to the volunteer survey, we asked them a very similar question, why do you believe organizations screen their volunteers? And the answers were a little bit more balanced, not by much, but notably, 32% stated public safety and protection of vulnerable people, 18% said it was about matching volunteers to the right role, and 21% stated that it was about both safety and matching. So we can see from the volunteers here that there's a little bit more emphasis on matching to the right role. And that brings us to our first learning moment, which focuses on just that. And the key takeaway here is to remember that screening volunteers should be approached as a balanced process, and that it's to address both safety and protection and matching volunteers to the right role. Screening should not focus solely on protection, as important as that is. It should really balance both the need for safety as well as creating meaningful opportunities for prospective volunteers. And one concrete way you can do that is actually go through your screening policies and practices and literally count or check how many of your screening steps are associated with safety and protection and how many are associated with matching volunteers to the right role, and try to ensure that there's an equal weight given to both. So the next set of data will focus on the question of how do we know our screening practices fit the needs of our organizations, our volunteers, or our communities? So sort of an exploration of feedback and evaluation. So the first question we'll review is from the nonprofit survey, and that is, to what extent do your volunteer screening practices fit the needs of your organization? And we found 64% say that their screening practices fit their needs completely, 31% said somewhat, and 5% said they do not fit their needs. And I think that those are actually really good numbers. The majority of organizations feel their current practices fit their organization's needs. And this was also supported in our focus groups as well. But what about that 36% of folks who said only somewhat or that they don't fit their needs? Why is that? So we asked them, why do they not fit your needs and what do you hope to improve? And the qualitative answers for this question actually varied considerably. No major themes were discovered as each respondent had their own reason for feeling that their processes weren't quite adequate. So I'll read a few examples of those qualitative answers, but if you want more examples of this, please do go read our report after the presentation because there are a few more examples in there. So the first example here says unsure. We use the VSP and templates from the website, which are good. A lot has changed over the COVID period, and perhaps some screening practices need to be revised to fit with the changes. This person says it just takes time and time is the culprit. And I'll just pause here to say that our focus groups with the nonprofit organizations really backed up this sentiment. Some nonprofit staff basically said, look, we know we could be doing better with our screening practices and we can try to be more relationship-based, but we just don't have the time, the capacity, or the resources to implement all of the policies and practices we would like to. The next example says, as we expand our team, we'll be looking to better manage our volunteers, ensuring timely updates of vulnerable sector checks and police checks, as well as maintaining up-to-date and accurate volunteer information. So the next thing we wanted to know was similar, but expanded out to the broader community. So we asked, to what extent your volunteer screening practices fit your community members' needs? And for this question, community members include participants and clients, as well as family or caretakers of participants and clients. And we saw very similar results. So 64% say they meet their community's needs completely, 29% said somewhat, and 7% said they do not fit their community's needs. And once again, we wanted to check with the 30% who said only somewhat or not at all and figure out why is that. So again, we asked them why, and we asked them what they hoped to improve. So this person says, we have no formal process and we need one to be posted on our website. This person said some volunteers feel intimidated by doing a police information check. This person says timing. We have a session that all individuals need to attend first before the application process. The timing doesn't work for all. Also, not everyone wants to attend this session, so they screen themselves out from the onset. Language, this is all facilitated in English. And with clients where English is an additional language, some screen themselves out immediately. Culture, screening practices are structured and based around North American Caucasian practices, which are sometimes challenging, daunting, overwhelming, or confusing to individuals that come from other cultural frames of reference. And I just wanted to note here that although we defined community members as participants and clients or families, it appears that organizations here are considering their volunteers as their community members. And a lot of the responses we got to this question focused on how their screening needs may not be meeting their volunteers' needs, rather than sort of the broader community, which is actually okay, because as I was going through this data to create this presentation, I realized we actually made an error in the way we asked the questions to nonprofit organizations. So we should have asked, to what extent do your volunteer screening practices fit the needs of your volunteers? Because we had asked regarding their organization and then their broader community, but we didn't actually ask about volunteers specifically. So our organization is new to research, and these are sort of the small mistakes that we're going to make as we're learning. But as you can see in these quotes, folks seem to answer this community question with volunteers in mind, as well as clients and other community members. So with that said, we'll go on to the next set of data here. So we saw that 64% of respondents to the nonprofit survey said that their screening practices completely meet the needs of their organization and community. And we wondered, do volunteers feel the same way? So we asked volunteers, to what extent do you feel the volunteer screening practices you've experienced meet your needs? 43% said completely, 52% said somewhat, and 4% said not at all. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we did have a smaller sample size for the volunteer survey, and therefore we should try not to overgeneralize these results. But from the 23 people who did answer this question, only 43% said the screening practices they'd experienced completely met their needs, which is quite a bit lower than the nonprofit results. And the volunteer focus group data also backed this up. On average, volunteers felt that the screening they had encountered mostly met their needs, but there were a few people who didn't have good experiences. And one of the most memorable examples of that is one of our volunteer focus group participants said they wanted to volunteer for their child's school, but they had not yet been in Canada for a year. So they weren't allowed to volunteer with the school because that was just the school's policy that folks couldn't volunteer until they'd been in Canada for a year. But overall, others felt that the screening they went through was appropriate and generally reasonable. So of the 56% of volunteers who indicated that the screening practices either only somewhat or did not meet their needs, we asked again, why did they not completely fit their needs and what do you hope to improve? And again, the qualitative answers here were pretty diverse, but we did actually have a couple of themes come out of them, mostly about being able to meet with organization staff and explain their interests and motivations to volunteer. So I'll just read out a couple of examples here. This person said, I've never been screened. There's little opportunity to dialogue about interest. It's all about what the organization needs for operations. I might have some flexibility in my role and how I carry out tasks and responsibilities, but that's most often provided after a longer time of service. This person said the requirements of screening were not made clear at the time of volunteering. This person said, I was not able to meet with the volunteer coordinator to explain my motivation for volunteering and abilities for the role. And this person said, because it's just stressful getting required documents for screening in a volunteer position. And I just want to share one last quote from that question because it really sums up most of what we've heard from volunteers in our volunteer focus groups. And this person said, screening is just one portion of the recruiting process, but what happens next is what makes the difference in the volunteer organization relationship. And that is the onboarding process. A tight relationship between the volunteer and the organization must be built or at least started up to generate positive results. Otherwise, they just deliver some work experience for the volunteer and some job done for the organization. And I do just want to clarify here that for us, this entire process to us is sort of, the screening process, right? Screening for us includes the recruiting process. It includes the onboarding process and all of that supervision and follow-up and feedback and things like that. But this person really reflects what we've heard from community members as well as folks in our focus groups, that most volunteers come to our organizations for a connection to something greater than themselves and also connection to other people. They want to feel that the work they are doing really matters and they want to build relationships. So the main theme in these responses is really about being able to meet with someone from the organization to properly explain their needs, interests, and values, which again was absolutely backed up in our focus groups. Okay, so we know that 64% of organizations feel their screening practices completely met the needs of their communities. And we were wondering, how do they know that? How often do organizations seek feedback from their volunteers and from community members about their volunteer screening practices? So we asked, does your organization seek feedback on its volunteer screening practices from its volunteers? And the answer here was pretty surprising. 45% of respondents said no, they don't seek feedback from volunteers on their volunteer screening practices. Next, we asked, does your organization seek feedback from community members? And in this case, 63% of respondents said no, they don't ask. So 64% of organizations feel that their screening practices meet their and their community's needs, but only 38% of them seek feedback from volunteers and only 13% seek feedback from the broader community. So I'm kind of sitting here left wondering, how did you know that? And this is a little bit of, like a cheeky or funny comment. But honestly, I do wish that we would have taken the opportunity on our survey to ask this question. How do you know that it's completely meeting the needs? Because I recognize that there are many ways that you can find out that it's meeting the needs of your community, and specifically asking them is just one measure of that. But the story continues to unfold when we ask volunteers if they've ever been asked to provide feedback on an organization's screening practices. And in this case, only 13% of respondents said yes. So again, this is a smaller sample size, but I think it still reveals something about the overall situation here. We would really like to see more organizations seeking feedback from their volunteers, as well as wider community members on their volunteer screening practices. We did also ask a follow-up question to the 38% and 13% if they can essentially recall a time that they adapted or changed their volunteer screening policies or practices in light of feedback from their community. And unfortunately, we got very few examples, but those examples are really worthwhile to go and read. So we've detailed them in our report, and I won't read them during today's presentation, but I would really invite you guys to go look at them because it gives some really cool examples of ways that people have responded to the feedback of their volunteers and their community members. Okay, so next we did ask a follow-up question to the organizations who stated they did not seek feedback from volunteers or community members. And we asked this in two separate questions, but the answers were really similar, and we were able to pull out three key themes from these answers. So the most common reason to why organizations don't seek feedback from their volunteers or community members is they didn't realize that they could, they didn't really think about it. They didn't realize they could or should. And I'm honestly really glad to see that this is the most frequent response, because I think it means with just a little gentle nudge or an invitation, more organizations may start doing this. And I can absolutely appreciate that sometimes things just don't occur to us until they've been suggested. So if that's your situation, this is your sign that you can start seeking feedback from your volunteers and the wider community about your screening practices. The next most common answer is that organization staff feel that volunteers and general community members are not best suited to provide feedback on screening practices because they lack the knowledge or expertise organizations feel they need to be involved in those conversations. And in my opinion, there were a concerning amount of answers that basically summed up to experts know best, and that it just wasn't necessary to include volunteers and community members in these conversations. And I have some thoughts and things to say about that, but I'll sum that up in the learning moment coming up in a minute. The last most common answer is that organizations did not have the resources, time, or capacity to engage volunteers or the wider community on these issues, or that they've actually tried to engage community and have gotten very low engagement. A couple other miscellaneous responses that I just wanted to share included the fact that although organizations may not specifically ask volunteers for feedback, they feel they get that feedback sort of organically, so they don't need to be intentional in asking. Another respondent said that they're aware volunteers already give so much of their time, and they don't want to take away any additional time from them unless absolutely necessary. So I can understand that as well, for sure. So what are the key takeaways from this data on feedback and evaluation? Overall, we feel it's important for organizations to be intentionally seeking feedback from volunteers, clients, participants, families, and the wider community about your volunteer screening practices and policies. And the most notable data in this whole set is that 64% of respondents say that their screening practices completely meet the needs of their community, but only 38% actively seek feedback from their volunteers, and only 13% seek feedback from the wider community. So organizations should ask themselves often, how do you know that your screening practices fit your community's needs, especially if you've not yet taken the opportunity to ask? And as I just said, some of the qualitative answers basically said, you know, we don't need to intentionally seek feedback because we get that organically. And I think that that's great. But we would also encourage you to not assume that all volunteers will approach you naturally with that feedback, and that you can be more intentional in asking for it. So you could even build in some specific ways to get that feedback, like maybe a survey that's sent out to folks once they complete the screening process, or perhaps scheduling an annual review with long-term volunteers in order to gather that feedback. The last thing I want to talk about is that trend of organizations not actively seeking feedback because of this underlying current, the notion that experts know best. And notably, this sort of what I would say is an adverse reaction occurred more when asked about seeking feedback from the wider community. It does appear organizations more readily recognize the value of asking volunteers for feedback. But I think it's important to remember that, of course, while experts certainly have expertise and our knowledge is vital to creating safe volunteer screening programs, it's also true that experts can often miss important information because it just exists beyond our own experiences. If you're only ever seeking feedback from volunteers who have made it through your doors, you're getting a small snapshot of the information. There could be a whole range of opinions on your screening practices, from folks who only made it halfway through your process, folks who were maybe turned away from the organization, or even folks who decided not to apply to your organization or screened themselves out for whatever reason that may be. I also recognize that some folks may be hesitant to ask for feedback broadly because you're not sure what your responsibility is to incorporate it or what your responsibility is to report back to the folks who provided that feedback. Some people might worry about, what if we didn't end up incorporating some of that feedback? We really don't want people to be frustrated with us or upset or accuse us of not listening. And so recently, our executive director, Mickey, actually shared with me this resource from the International Association for Public Participation. And it details essentially the different levels of involvement the community may have, and also helps you understand the organization's responsibilities to report back and follow up with people who provided feedback. So I'll share that resource with folks after the session, but essentially the spectrum goes from inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. Overall, if folks are suggesting unreasonable or unsafe practices, obviously we don't want to put those suggestions into practice. But if volunteers in the wider community are saying the same thing over and over, it could really be a signal that the best practices just aren't working for everyone, and that the experts may need some support to reimagine what good practices in screening could look like that are supported by the wider community. And the last thing I'll say here is that just remember, the biggest reason folks said they didn't ask for feedback is because they just didn't think about it or didn't know that they could or should. So if your organization has the time and the capacity, there is a lot of great value in asking volunteers and the wider community for input on your screening practices and policies. Because even if they're not directly engaged with your organization, they may have thoughts and feedback that could be really valuable, and you may be surprised about what people have to say. So the next topic, I flashed some of this data on the screen early on, and I do just want to explore just a little bit. We asked organizations, how consistently does your organization use risk assessments when developing or updating volunteer positions? And we found that 44% use them for all volunteer positions, 32% use them for some volunteer positions, and 24% do not use them for their volunteer positions. And we feel like these are actually really good numbers. We are super happy to see so many of you doing risk assessments on all of your volunteer positions. So thank you very much for doing that. What's interesting to note is when we asked a follow-up question of what does your risk assessment process look like, there were still a lot of organizations saying that their risk assessment process is tied to the individual volunteers rather than the volunteer role. So that brings us to our learning moment for risk assessments, and that is risk assessments should be conducted on volunteer positions overall, not the individual volunteers. And that individual assessment will happen in their individual screening process through the application and interviews and reference checks and background checks and all of those kinds of things. But it's important and really valuable for organizations to regularly and periodically review your volunteer positions overall to assess the level of risk inherent in that position. So some good practices in conducting risk assessments include consulting with a risk management professional, or even utilizing like a rubric or matrix to essentially grade the volunteer positions on a scale from low risk to high risk. And when I say risk, that means risk to your program participants and clients, risk to the volunteers themselves, or risk to the organization overall. And the reason that risk assessments are so important is that it's a key tool in determining what your screening process for a particular role should entail. We heard over and over in both our volunteer focus groups as well as the nonprofit focus groups that the level of screening, which includes interviews, reference checks, background checks, training and orientation, all of those steps, the level of screening should be directly tied to the complexity and the level of risk associated with a given volunteer role. There should be more in-depth screening or for more complex or high-risk roles, and less in-depth screening for roles that are simple and have very low levels of risk. Redoing risk assessments can also result in changes to your screening process, and you may end up actually removing barriers for your volunteers and increasing your engagement. Or you might identify a gap in your risk mitigation practices that needs to be filled. So I would ask everyone here, please do risk assessments as often as possible on all of your volunteer roles. And we actually have a whole other hour-long presentation on just assessing risk. We also have some helpful tools and templates to help you assess that risk. So I'd encourage all of you to head over to our resource library on our website. You can search different key terms. So if you just type in risk, we have a bunch of different tools and things like that that will help you out with that. Last thing I'll say is if your risk assessments haven't been done in the past maybe 2 years or so, we would really recommend redoing or establishing a process to do that. Okay, so given that a big reason we embarked on this research is to look deeper into issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, or ideas, the next set of data will focus on asking organizations and volunteers whether the volunteer screening practices they've implemented or experienced are equitable and inclusive. So the first set of data relating to ideas in volunteer screening and engagement is simply, has your organization implemented any volunteer screening policies or practices intended to improve equitability for volunteers? And we found that 32% of respondents said yes, 43% said they were unsure, and 25% said no. And I really wish I could go back to those people who said unsure, ask them to follow up, and then come back and answer the survey again, because it's possible with the amount of people that were unsure that perhaps they just need to gather more information, and we might see that 32% increase. Still, I do think it's unfortunate that 43% of volunteer engagement specialists who answered this survey were unsure about this question. So maybe that points to more need for communication internally about the purpose of certain policies. On the volunteer side, we asked a similar question. Do you know of any organizations who use volunteer screening practices or policies that are intended to improve equitability for volunteers? Or do you recall a time when an organization made an accommodation for you or another volunteer? And in this case, only 9% of volunteers answered yes, 59% said no, and again, there were a decent amount of respondents who were unsure, so it's good to note that. And again, we really should try hard not to overgeneralize these results too much, but I think that you can still see from the data that it tells a very different story when you're looking at the perspective of organizations versus the perspective of volunteers. So of the 32% of nonprofit organizations who said, yes, we have implemented these policies and practices, we then asked those folks to provide an example or even a link to their equity-based policy or practice. So overall, in that last question, the 32% of people who said yes amounted to about 20 different respondents. So those 20 respondents were given the opportunity to provide examples, and only 8 people actually did. So again, each of those examples is really worth reviewing in their own right, and all of the examples have been detailed in our report, but for the sake of time, I'll just give 2 examples here today. So one person says, decolonizing screening, which is basically meant doing very little screening. We post a position, and if the volunteer seems like a good fit, we approve them. And we give them instructions on how to do the job. Most of our positions are virtual. All they need to do is complete the application online, which takes less than 5 minutes. This person said, we have working agreements with various organizations that support vulnerable persons who wish to volunteer with us to help navigate the screening process, as well as continuous support during their volunteer time, which is a really cool thing to see. Okay, so moving forward with more questions about equity and inclusion in the volunteer screening process, we asked nonprofit organizations to indicate to what extent they agree or disagree with a few statements regarding their organization. So recall that 32% of respondents indicated that they have implemented policies and practices intended to improve equity for volunteers. Yet 86% either agree or strongly agree that their practices are equitable. So this suggests many organizations believe their practices are equitable without having implemented specific or intentional policies to improve equitability. 85% of respondents also agree or strongly agree that their volunteer screening practices are inclusive. And it's interesting to note here, my little laser pointer, that on average, people seem to feel more strongly that their policies and practices are inclusive rather than equitable. It's not by much, but I just thought that that was sort of interesting to note. So the data in this table, coupled with that previous question, could essentially mean that organizations are organically equitable and inclusive, and that they have a culture embedded throughout the organization that is geared towards equitability and inclusion. So it's possible that this is a really good news story. On the other hand, and maybe this is where the critical part of me comes out, it could potentially suggest an over-assumption of how equitable and inclusive their policies and practices genuinely are, especially given how very few organizations solicit feedback from their volunteers and community members regarding their practices, and also given how many organizations are unsure of whether they have implemented any practices with the goal of improving equity and inclusion. Lastly, we also wanted to know whether organizations felt they had enough staff, time, and funding to devote to developing and maintaining equitable and inclusive screening practices. So 62% of respondents either agree or strongly agree with that statement, and 16% disagree or strongly disagree with that statement. So this again points to what we heard in our focus groups with nonprofit staff, that it's not from a lack of wanting to implement these policies. A lot of times it's due to a lack of resources such as staff, time, and funding to develop and maintain these equitable and inclusive screening practices. So let's flip back over to our volunteer survey. We heard from nonprofits how equitable and inclusive they feel their screening practices are, so we wanted to know whether volunteers had experienced them the same way. And here we asked volunteers to indicate to what extent they feel the screening practices they had experienced were equitable and inclusive. And just note that we included an option for NA or not applicable here in the volunteer survey, because we were aware that there might be folks answering the survey who have applied for volunteer roles, but who didn't get accepted into any of those roles. So 43% of volunteers agree or strongly agree that the organization's practices are equitable, and that was versus 86% of organizations. 21% of these volunteers either disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. And 55% of volunteers agree or strongly agree that organizations' practices are inclusive, and that was versus 85% of organizations. And 9% of these volunteers disagreed with that statement. So again, here, the story is quite different when we're looking from the perspective of nonprofit organizations versus volunteers themselves. And it's difficult to say just from looking at this data and in the context that our volunteer survey had a smaller sample size, but it might be the case that organizations sort of have overinflated how equitable and inclusive their volunteer screening practices genuinely are, because it looks like volunteers aren't really experiencing them in the same way. So the last slice of data pie I'll give you in this topic before the learning moment is based on the question, is your organization interested in exploring or updating their screening policies from an EDI perspective? 55% said yes, 28% were unsure, and 17% said no. And at first I found that 17% flat out saying no to be a bit concerning. And look, it might still be. But we did not ask a follow-up question asking why they answered no. So a reason that they may have answered no is maybe they've actually already done this in their recent history. Maybe they're not interested in doing it again so soon. But without having asked the follow-up question, we're left wondering how many organizations are truly not interested in exploring or updating their screening policies from an EDI perspective, and whether or not we should be concerned about that number. On the positive side, given that around 85% of folks state that they already believe their policies are equitable and inclusive, having 55% say that they're still interested in exploring or updating their screening policies from an EDI perspective, I think that's really promising. And it suggests that organizations are willing to continue this work and recognize that there's always room for improvement in this area. So the key learnings or takeaway from this data on equity and inclusion and volunteer screening. It appears there may be some overassumption of how equitable and inclusive an organization's screening practices are. So we recommend organizations should not assume their policies and practices are equitable and inclusive, and instead be intentional about asking for feedback and also critically analyzing your policies and practices from an EDI lens. We also wanted to mention that we know having concrete policies is one way to be accountable and ensure your organization is reducing barriers to participation and working towards an entirely equitable and inclusive volunteer program. However, nourishing a culture of equity and inclusion in your organization requires more than policy work. So we must also take the time as individuals and organizations to do the deep inner work to understand and interrogate our ways of making sense of the world and how they have biases embedded within them. The other thing I wanted to note on this topic is that if organizations have in fact done some of this work and have implemented some of these practices, it may also be the case that they're not really talking about it, and volunteers don't know about the work that they've been doing to improve their organization's equity and inclusion. So perhaps in the future, we could maybe talk about how to balance aspects of performativity and tokenism with the idea of transparency and accountability. And we don't have time to get into that big topic right now, but it could be valuable for us to explore in the future and also for your organizations to explore on your own. If you are looking for information on how to develop policies and practices in screening that are more geared towards equity and inclusion, I would recommend reading Volunteer Connector's report, An Anti-Racist Approach to Volunteering. You can check out Jedi Hub, their website, and you can also read our virtual volunteer screening and engagement guidebook. That guidebook is primarily about virtual volunteers, but all of the information can be extrapolated to in-person volunteers. And we were really intentional throughout the entire document to provide specific suggestions, information, and ideas on EDI throughout the whole volunteer screening and engagement process. So I would really recommend you explore those resources to get some ideas. And all of those three things that I just mentioned, I will be sending out in the package after this session. The last thing I wanted to mention is that we use Volunteer Canada's 10 steps to screening very regularly, and our focus groups with nonprofit staff actually had them comment on the 10 steps and identified gaps in the process. And the focus groups identified that ensuring your screening practices and policies are equitable and inclusive is something that's missing from the 10 steps to screening. So we hope to have some future conversations with Volunteer Canada about potentially updating the 10 steps and even potentially removing reference checks as step 6. There's been a lot of community research showing that it presents significant barriers to BIPOC folks, especially newcomers. And so that's actually a really perfect segue into our last set of data here, which dives into the overall screening process, but also specifically focuses in on background checks as one part of that screening process. So we asked both nonprofits and volunteers to explain their understanding of when it is appropriate and necessary to obtain a vulnerable sector check for a prospective volunteer. 28% of nonprofits provided answers that VA feels are reflective of good practices in obtaining vulnerable sector checks. And those practices include only obtaining vulnerable sector checks for volunteers who are in direct contact with vulnerable populations, have a position of trust or authority over that population, and or unsupervised access to that vulnerable population. For volunteers, only 4% answered consistent with those good practices. And I think that this points to the need for organizations to be educating volunteers more about when it is and when it's not appropriate to be asked for a vulnerable sector check. Vulnerable sector checks can be very invasive, and therefore we should only be asking for them when it's absolutely necessary in order to protect volunteers' privacy and respect their rights. So the majority of both nonprofits and volunteers stated that vulnerable sector checks are appropriate when a volunteer is working directly with vulnerable populations, regardless of holding a position of trust or authority or that unsupervised access. And we really feel that because vulnerable sector checks are so invasive that they shouldn't be required if a volunteer is working with a vulnerable population in a supervised area, a public area, around other staff or like trusted and screened volunteers. So this is the message that we're trying to spread and part of the conversation that we're trying to shift. So one of the big things we wanted to explore in this research is the impact of background checks on volunteer engagement and the screening process overall. So we asked a few questions related to that. So our first one here is we asked nonprofits, if applicable, how has the use of background checks in your screening process impacted your volunteer engagement? And this was one of the surprising results because there was such an even split. So 22% reported a positive or slightly positive impact. And some of those examples include increasing community trust, confidence, and perception of safety for volunteers and participants. And this was also backed up in our volunteer focus groups. Volunteers reported seeing organizations ask for a background check as like reassurance that the organization is appropriately assessing risk and is a safe organization to engage with. 29% reported no impact, positive or negative. 27% reported a negative or slightly negative impact. And some of those examples included, additional processing and administration time, long wait times to get the checks back in some cases, or difficulty of access for equity deserving folks. And 22% of these answers were sort of unclear. They didn't quite fit into any of these categories, or they just wrote not applicable. So going over to the volunteer survey, we asked them whether they thought background checks should be required to volunteer. And 32% of folks said yes, 64% said sometimes, and 4% said no. And we asked a follow-up question and invited volunteers to elaborate on their answer to this question. And the majority of those responses indicated that it depends on the context and what the role entails. They recognize the need to balance safety with the fact that asking for background checks could potentially create a barrier for some people, depending on their social location and context. And this sentiment was also backed up in our volunteer focus groups. Those folks also understand that sometimes background checks are necessary, but they want to see that the requirement for background checks matches the level of risk and complexity of the volunteer role. Next, we asked volunteers two very similar questions. We asked, have you ever not applied for a volunteer role due to screening requirements? And have you ever experienced volunteer screening as a barrier to volunteering? And we got very similar results for both, which I think is great for consistency and ensuring that people understand what's being asked. So from this data here, it appears most respondents to our volunteer survey have not experienced screening as a barrier and have rarely been deterred from applying to a role due to those screening requirements. And we'll get into in a few minutes some examples and perhaps some reasons for that 23% and 19% of folks who answered that yes, it had been a barrier or a deterrent from applying to a volunteer role. So we were also curious about specific screening methods and whether or not they present or impact folks' potential to volunteer with an organization, either positively or negatively. And as you can see here, the most common answer for most of these is actually no, it actually doesn't make that big of an impact. However, what you can see from this is that volunteer applications, as well as the interview process, seems to be screening steps that on average make people more likely to want to volunteer. And this was backed up in our focus groups as well as qualitative answers to this question. Volunteers want opportunities to talk with volunteer engagement specialists and tell them why they're interested in a position and what their motivations are. Another thing this data tells us is that personal references, professional references, and background checks do present barriers and can deter people from volunteering. However, what's really interesting about that is for each person saying references would make them less likely to volunteer, there are almost just as many people, and in some cases, a couple more people saying that those steps would make them more likely to volunteer. Background checks are a little bit of a different story. You can definitely see that there is a difference there. So I ended up filtering the results from this table to see if there were any themes along the lines of whether or not someone identified as belonging to an equity deserving group. And I did find that on average, folks who belong to an equity deserving group were more likely to identify personal and professional references and background checks as making them less likely to volunteer. Folks who did not identify as belonging to an equity deserving group were more likely to identify the personal and professional references and background checks as making them more likely to volunteer. So we can see that there are some different experiences and different opinions, and it stems from that demographic data and that identity piece. So when we asked volunteers if they would like to elaborate on those 3 questions above, here's just a few examples of what they said. This person said, if I want to volunteer with an organization, I am willing to jump through the necessary hoops. This person said, information that I can provide myself to an organization, like an application form, an interview, a background check, are relatively straightforward and don't present much of a barrier. Professional references are more of a barrier as it involves asking others for their time and providing me with a reference. This person says, the more screening there is, the more complex the job is. I'm looking for challenging things. And this person says, I believe a certain level of checks and informal interviews could be conducted, but not extreme as though it were a formal paid employment. So we also wanted to explore whether specific background checks would have more of an impact on a volunteer's engagement than others. And the answer is pretty much no. They all sort of have a similar no impact response. The thing I want you to take away from this slide, though, is that, again, for as many people saying that these background checks would make them less likely to volunteer, we have just as many people, or even a few more, saying that these background checks would make them more likely to volunteer. And I'll reiterate this in the learning moment, but it's really important to recognize that folks have very diverse reactions to being asked for a background check, or as we saw in the last slide, even being asked for reference checks. So it's really important that organizations think about who you are trying to recruit as volunteers. Who are your clients and participants? And so how are you trying to match the demographics of your volunteers with your clients and participants? And does your screening process invite participation from people of one particular demographic more than others? And in the interest of time, I won't read out many quotes from volunteers about this question, but I will show just this one because it really backs up what we're hearing from community members, as well as organizations who have done some of this anti-racism work on their volunteer screening processes. And this person said in response to this question, I respect that as a light-skinned male without a criminal record, the above process does not represent a barrier. If I was otherwise, I may feel intimidated by them. So another thing we try to emphasize in our educational materials is the importance of having clear policies or procedures that advise on what to do should some information be revealed on a background check. So we ask nonprofit organizations, what is your organization's policy or procedure if and when information is revealed on a background check? And this was another one of those kind of surprising responses because 46% said they do not have a policy or a procedure to deal with that situation. 37% of organizations deal with these situations on a case-by-case basis, which I would say does reflect what VA feels is good practice. It should really come down to what information was revealed on the check, what is the volunteer role, and are they related in any way? The folks who said this, though, didn't necessarily state that they have clear policies on what may be accepted or not. And I honestly think that that's a mistake in the way we asked the question. We could have been more clear to state, like, do you have a clear policy on this? So this was sort of a little bit of surprising data, and we would really recommend organizations have clear policies and procedures about what to do in these cases. So even if your process is that it's a case-by-case decision-making process, who's responsible for that decision? How is that decision communicated to the volunteer? Can the volunteer appeal that decision? Is there any room for discussion after that decision has been made? So things like that. And this is where a policy may come in handy. So all of this brings us to our final learning moment of the day on screening overall, but specifically about background checks as one part of that screening process. And one key takeaway here is that the level of screening your organization practices for various volunteer roles should be directly tied to the complexity and level of risk associated with a volunteer position. And this applies to all of your screening steps, including your application, interviews, whether you ask for reference checks or not, whether you ask for background checks or not, or even how extensive your orientation and your training is. The other key learning from this data is that there are both benefits and challenges to the use of background checks in the screening process. Therefore, we recommend organizations take a curious and open approach to obtaining background checks for volunteers. And what I mean by that is get curious about what is it you're trying to confirm through that background check. Background checks have been proven to be essentially one snapshot in time of a person's life. And it's also been shown that having a criminal record or having something come up on a background check is not a good predictor of a person's future likelihood to commit crimes or act unethically. So a lot of organizations say, well, we get background checks done to confirm that, our volunteer is a safe person. And with this context in mind, I want you to get curious about, does this document really confirm whether your volunteer is a safe person or not? Are there other ways you could confirm that information, ways that would present less barriers and be more equitable practice? So again, like increase those interview opportunities, so those opportunities for training and orientation, those opportunities for supervision and support and feedback and checking in. Maybe having like a volunteer buddy system where, a trusted or longer term volunteer can be buddied up with a newer volunteer. So there are lots of relationship-based ways that we can confirm, whether our volunteers are, safe or effective in their roles. And absolutely, sometimes background checks are necessary, and I completely recognize that. What we are trying to do is sort of just encourage people to really think about the purpose of your background checks and just double check whether it actually, meets that purpose. The other thing I'll reiterate is that people have very diverse reactions to being asked to provide references and background checks, but those reactions do line up with different demographics. So folks who do not identify as belonging to an equity deserving group tend to report that they don't mind being asked for these things. They have nothing to hide. They tend to feel more confident and safe with the organizations who ask for them. On the other hand, it's been shown in research and anecdotally from community members that folks who identify as belonging to an equity deserving group will experience background checks and reference checks as a barrier, a potentially significant barrier in some cases. Our data, as well as other organizations' data, supports the idea that depending on your demographics and how you identified, being asked for a background check or reference checks can be an intimidating process. And what it does is it sort of imports or it transfers the inequities in our justice system into our volunteer organizations and into our volunteer programs. So ultimately, there are both benefits and challenges to the use of background checks in the screening process. And there are so many different factors that need to be assessed and taken into context, and even think about your recruitment strategy. Who are you trying to recruit to your volunteer program? What are their philosophies and values and experiences? And how will those experiences impact how they engage with your screening and overall engagement process? And lastly, again, we heard consistently that the level of screening and how involved it is should be directly tied to the complexity and nature of the volunteer role. Volunteers want to feel that the level of screening they receive is in line with the level of risk associated with the volunteer position. And I'll just give one last shout out for completing risk assessments as part of that process to determine that. So, if I could sum up this entire presentation in just 5 sentences, it would be these. Screening should be about both safety and matching volunteers to the right roles, ones that will be fulfilling for them. Take an intentional and open approach to feedback with community stakeholders and think carefully about your responsibilities to incorporate their feedback and report back to them. Risk assessments are conducted on the volunteer role, not individual volunteers. Please don't assume your practices and policies are equitable and inclusive. Ask and be intentional in your policies, practices, and internal work to challenge our biases. And lastly, background checks are complex and they require careful consideration. They present significant barriers to BIPOC and other equity-deserving folks, and this should be considered carefully when crafting recruitment methods and your overall screening process. And when we mentioned in our webinar description that we would talk about how our research findings would influence the volunteer screening program going forward, these are essentially the things that we're going to be focusing on in the future and trying to emphasize in our educational materials and our coaching with organizations. So these are the most high level findings, and we actually have so much more data to inform our future area of focus. We are really looking forward to this next phase of the volunteer screening program, and we hope that all of you are just as excited about taking these learnings back to your organization and reviewing your screening and engagement practices from this lens. So that is our presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I just want to say a special thank you and a shout out to everyone who participated in our surveys, our focus groups, and in the volunteer screening program overall. None of our work would be possible without you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to everyone for coming today to participate in this session. So I'll just flash quickly our website there, as well as an email address. This email address goes generally to our volunteer screening program team inbox. So any one of our VSP team members would be happy to chat with you. Okay, woohoo, all right. Thank you guys for sticking that out. It was a long presentation. So I'm gonna stop sharing so that I can actually come back and see all of you. Sharing. Okay, participants. All right, let's see what we got here for a Q&A. And I'm wondering, Graham, were there any particular questions that seem to have more votes?
No, but I can just kind of read out the questions that I kind of noted I would read out for you in the question section.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
The first question we had was from Neil, and we actually got a note in the chat as well that was about this topic as well, was how can you deduce anything substantive from such a small sample size?
Okay. Thanks for the question. I mean, look, as far as I know, in terms of community-based research, 71% is 71 responses is certainly enough to be able to draw some inferences. The 38 respondents definitely is a smaller sample size, and so we do need to be a little bit more careful. But if we think about, our entire, nonprofit community in Alberta, I do think that it is reasonable for us to draw some inferences from this. And again, we're not trying to draw substantive things here, but I do think that these point to what we've heard from community already. And it was backed up in our focus groups as well. So we do feel fairly confident in being able to say, you know what, we do think that this is the average experience of both nonprofits as well as volunteers. So I hope that answers your question. And Graham, do you have anything additional to say to that?
I should note that we do acknowledge, though, that it is a smaller sample size than we would have liked. And I think that one thing to note, too, is that we do intend to continue doing research as an organization, and I will also be kind of following up on the indicators that were brought forward for this research project. So I think that the other part of that answer is that we need to continue to gather data and make sure that our assumptions aren't just based on one survey or a few focus groups from years ago or something like that. We would like to continue getting data as we go along. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
The next question we had here was from Shaminda. He asked, through your findings, do you feel that the screening steps themselves need to change, or is that the way the screening steps are applied that needs to align with the current times?
Very good question. Yeah, I would say it's probably a little bit of both. Like I did mention, I do think that we can adapt and change some of the screening steps. So I do hold, kind of questions and curiosities about removing reference checks as step 6, given the research that, it does present a barrier, as well as sort of, including that additional step of just, checking your policies and practices for EDI or ideas overall. So I do think that there are small adjustments that could be made to respond to some of the current trends, but overall, we did hear from the nonprofit organizations who, checked out those 10 steps, that they said, you know what, yeah, this actually aligns with what we do. We think this does meet our practice, and meet our needs. Honestly, the biggest thing they said that how it doesn't meet their needs is that, 10 steps is a lot of steps. And with organizations having sometimes a lack of resources, staff, and time, that it's difficult to fully implement all 10 of those steps in like a truly relationship-based way, where you're truly building a connection with the volunteer and not just sort of like checking things off a list or just like getting the document, filing it away in a folder, and sort of not talking to that volunteer. So I do think that it's sort of a balance and challenge between the amount of time and resources that that nonprofit organizations have, and sort of the need to establish those relationships, and those connections. So it's a little bit of both. I would say that the screening steps, do meet people's needs. There's definitely some differences in how those steps are applied, but I do think that there is some room to maybe adjust or adapt some of those steps. Graham, did you have anything to add on that one?
No, I think that you definitely got it. You got it.
Cool. Thanks.
So the next question, which was more, I guess, kind of a note from the chat, was Terry had mentioned that like some ideas of what types of questions to ask volunteers. And then Rospina also asked, what are the top 8 to 10 screening questions organizations may ask on our application forms?
Interesting. Okay, so one thing pops in my mind, which is we have this tool or template, and it's called the window of work. But basically, it's just like a 4-quadrant resource that goes over like why the volunteer is interested in the role, sort of what makes them connected to the issue, what makes them passionate about the issue. Then there are sort of, the gifts that they can contribute, the skills and things like that they can contribute to the organization, and knowledge that they can contribute. The 4th quadrant is about what they are trying to get from the volunteer experience. What goals do they as the volunteer have in coming to this volunteer position? And the last quadrant is called the no-nos, and it sort of talks about like, what are they really not interested in doing, and also what are they maybe not able to do. So through those 4 different quadrants, we have found, that you can really get a good sense of people's motivations for why they want to volunteer, what they can contribute. The organization can make sure that they're meeting the volunteers' goals. And then there's sort of some boundary setting and some, ways for both the volunteer and the organization to say like, this is kind of where I draw the line, and I'm not interested in doing this. So that's more for sort of like very concrete folks. But we've also led volunteers in some presentations through this exercise called the gifts of the head, heart, and hands. And through that, it's just more of an abstract sort of reflection opportunity and exercise for volunteers to be able to think about, what are the gifts of knowledge that I bring for the head? What are the gifts of passion that I bring, or, sort of love or things like that from the heart? And for the hands, what are the things that I can concretely do for this organization? And so presenting that information to an organization, and an organization taking intentional time to ask those questions to the volunteer, I think can definitely help a lot in creating those meaningful experiences, and just making sure that everyone is on the same page when they're starting that volunteer experience. We also have a ton of like templates and things like that online for like applications and interview questions and things like that as well. So definitely check out our resource library. And we have a specific tab, like we've got this grid menu, and it says volunteer screening and engagement. So if you click on that specifically, then all of those resources are going to be freely available. None of them are going to be blocked behind a membership wall, and all of them relate directly to volunteer screening and engagement. The other thing that the VSP team does is one-on-one coaching with organizations. So if you ever wanted to reach out to us with your volunteer screening practices and policies and sort of have a meeting where we can provide a little bit of coaching or answer some specific questions, we're also happy to do that.
And I just wanted to note as well, because there was a question about it in the chat, we'll be sending out all this info after the presentation as well. And any of the resources that we reference here will kind of get sent out too, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, definitely. I will be sending out a full package of resources as well as the recording for this presentation. And I'll make sure also to give like a PDF of the slides, because obviously my speaking notes dived into a lot more details about the information that wasn't necessarily on the slides. So I'll make sure that you guys get my speaking notes as well.
For sure. So there was another question in the question section here. It was somebody who would like to know how VA intends to support organizations who want to implement ideas, like the inclusive practices.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely. So our ideas on how to support ideas is basically to just be a lot more intentional in our own educational resources. So I think that we have started to dabble in that. So we published a virtual volunteer screening and engagement guidebook last year. And like I said in the presentation, we were super intentional throughout that entire document to provide information, suggestions, examples, additional resources about EDI or ideas. And so that is sort of our first step in moving forward with this work. We also recognize that we are not the experts in this. It's people who are every day doing these practices and implementing practices and policies for equity and inclusion and diversity and ideas and all of that, who are already doing the work on the ground level. So it's not going to be only us, kind of creating resources and sending them out. We also are going to highlight and amplify, voices, experiences, work, resources that are already being done in the community on this topic, because we know that there are a lot of organizations and a lot of people who are doing this work already. So it's going to be us definitely doing some educational resources, maybe some presentations or tools or things like that in the future with concrete suggestions, but also looking a little bit more to sort of partner or collaborate or amplify the folks and groups out there in the community who are already doing this work.
for sure. And we also got a comment in the question section here, and I can't quite tell if it's related specifically to ideas or not, but it says, it seems like there's a lot of criticism of where people are at without providing an accessible entry point. There are many Alberta organizations who have already created tools related to this that could be shared. Many organizations don't think about volunteers as the starting point for this work with good reason. Organizations may already be doing this work, but they aren't at a place of implementing it as it relates to their volunteers.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that's a really good point. And like we said, reflected in our focus group with nonprofit organizations, when we kind of said, could we help facilitate doing more of those relationship-based steps? And it really comes down to, timing, capacity, resources, all of those kinds of things. So we do what we can. We do have a very small screening development grant. They're micro grants of $2,000 to $3,000. We have limited funding, so we're not able to provide that grant to a large swath of people. But our announcement for those grants will probably go out in about June of this year, and it starts up in the fall. So if you sign up to be, if you want to receive updates about that or receive a notification when that announcement is made, we can certainly do that. Just send us an email, because that, I think, is one small thing that we can do to try and help increase organizations' capacity to do this work. And Graham, feel free to, I didn't have a comment in front of me, so I'm sure I missed a lot of points there. So if you had things to say in response to that too, feel free.
No, I said that I thought it was really good feedback, and it's exactly the type of thing that we need to know and hear. So I definitely think that we need to be able to come to the organizations where they're at, because a lot of organizations aren't doing this work, not because they don't want to, but because they literally can't. They are restricted in the ways that they could be approaching the topic, or they already have a lot of other plans to start doing work related to this work from a different perspective. So, yeah. And the other question that I see open here is from Ardith. How did you recruit participants for these surveys and focus groups?
Yeah, for sure. So basically for the surveys and the focus groups, what we did is we put out just a general call on our social media page and our website. We also utilized Volunteer Connector. Volunteer Connector is sort of like an online hub of volunteer positions. So think about it like an Indeed for jobs, but for volunteer positions. So we put out calls on social media, our website, and Volunteer Connector. And we basically ask people to, for the focus groups, like sign up via a doodle poll. We then had, specific criteria for them to be able to participate. So for the volunteers, they needed to have, applied for at least one volunteer position in Alberta in the past year, things like that. We also got them to fill out consent forms and gave them all like the informed consent of how they could withdraw their data or consent or things like that too. So that's generally how we recruited participants for the surveys and the focus groups. And we actually, in our report that I'll send out later today, it actually dives into that, and it gives you the entire script that we used essentially to sort of explain what the survey was, what the focus groups were, and all of that kind of stuff. So hopefully that gives a little bit of like meta information if folks want to sort of take on a research project like this. I'm hoping that we've given enough sort of examples of how we approach this work for you guys to be able to replicate it.
Perfect. Thanks, Vicky. And I don't see any other open questions. I'm just going to take one more scroll through here to see if I'm missing anything. David noted a couple things that I had answered in the chat about Accreditation Canada, and I just kind of noted that we should reach out to them and talk to them because we haven't.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I should note here too that like a lot of folks, maybe not a lot, some folks, when we ask like, why do you screen your volunteers or why do you do background checks or things like that, there's always a decent amount of people who say, look, like our parent organization or our insurance company requires this, it mandates it. We would love to not have to ask for background checks, but we are mandated to do that in some cases. And I completely understand that for sure. And so some of the things that we are, perhaps thinking about doing in the future is, how can we have a role in that conversation, and exactly trying to figure out exactly what our role would be in that conversation, and how we can, speak to insurance companies about these mandates and kind of gather more information about it and kind of get a little bit more on the same page.
Absolutely. Okay. I don't see anything else. If anybody has their hand up, though, I don't know if I can see it or not because my webinar technology seems to be doing something a little bit strange.
No worries. I can see it here actually, and I can see no one has their hand up or anything yet, but we do just have a few more minutes. So if anyone wanted to ask another question or even put your hand up, I can unmute you so you can ask verbally if you want to. Oh, one person asked, can you share a visual of those 4 quadrants when you send the follow-up? I absolutely will. Yeah, I'll definitely send the window of work resource.
Yes. Good.
Thank you so much, Shaminda. Appreciate it. I'm just scrolling up the chat here. I'm so glad that so many of you found this presentation helpful and useful, and we are always game to continue this conversation and have more chats with people about these things. And also, if anything we said in this presentation doesn't quite fit for your scenario, or you're thinking like, whoa, that just really wouldn't work for us, we would love to hear that, right? our job is to notice and collect the good practices around us, and also hear from our community what is challenging about these, good practices that we are advocating for. So I would really invite and encourage everyone to reach out to us to have, sort of those smaller conversations, because it's really valuable for us to note your feedback and to take that into consideration in the future of our work.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up as far as I can see in the questions.
Okay, awesome.
We have 2 minutes to spare.
That's great. That's perfect. Okay. Well, I mean, I'll stick around for the last 2 minutes. If anyone wants to ask a question here, I will stay to the bitter end here, but thank you everyone so much for attending. And also thank you to the entire VA team for supporting us and me in all of this work. There were a lot of sort of last minute, like, hey, can you double check my presentation, or, double check the report and things like that. So I also just want to say thank you to my whole team for supporting me through this. And again, another big thank you to all of the nonprofit organizations and volunteers who shared their wisdom with us. So thank you very much. And with that, I hope all of you have a fantastic rest of your day, rest of your week, and hopefully we can chat again in the future about everything volunteer screening. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, and it is officially 1:30, so I am going to sign off here. Please do reach out if you have any questions or any follow-up after this presentation, though. Thank you very much, everyone.